Alright, so here is a video that is an overview of 6.5. There are a couple of things that I'm going to go through pretty quickly because there's another video that explains in a little more detail because it's a fairly complicated process. So let me just tell you that 6.5 is about nerves, hormones, and homeostasis, and in essence it's how your body communicates with itself around the body. So there are two main ways. First is the nervous system and then via hormones. And we'll talk about nerves first and then hormones. But I want to define homeostasis. For those of you who don't remember from ninth grade, homeostasis is essentially the ability to maintain some kind of stable environment. And some people might even argue, actually a lot of cellular biologists and molecular biologists argue that what qualifies to be alive is the ability to maintain homeostasis in a changing environment. So in essence, it's responding to stimuli. A cell has to be able to maintain some kind of equilibrium, whether it or a certain gradient, which we'll talk about, we'll talk about with nerves. But it needs to be able to maintain a certain level in a changing environment, and when it's unable to do that, it dies. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to osmosis. And for example, when an organism that lives in fresh water gets transplanted into an environment with salt water, it's not able to maintain homeostasis as far as salinity and water content goes, and that leads to death because that organism is no longer able to maintain homeostasis. Anyways, we're going to talk about how nerves and hormones help maintain homeostasis and ways that they use homeostasis to send signals around the body. So let's go ahead and get started. So 6.5.1 says state, remember what that word means, that the nervous system consists of the central nervous system. This is the first part of it. So you need to know what the central nervous system is, and you need to know that that is made out of the brain and the spinal cord. And the brain has many different sections to it that we attribute to different skill sets. And what's interesting is really the research in which the ways that we find out we found out what sections do what, and before a lot of the modern technology, essentially what people were doing were looking at sections in which people had some brain damage and the skill set they were no longer able to do, and then they attributed that skill set or that kind of thinking to that section of the brain. And now when we use MRIs or other technology, we're able to figure out where most brain activity is when being asked to do certain things. But anyways, so the brain and the spinal cord are part of the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is the rest of the nerves that come off of that. So all the nerves in your brain are part of the central nervous system, and so is the spinal cord. But branching off of the spinal cord, these nerves connect to every single organ in your body. They get to your skin. Essentially, these nerves are throughout your body, and that's all part of the peripheral nervous system. And a good way to remember that is like your peripheral vision. It's stuff on the outside that you're not focused on. So we've got the central core of the brain and the spinal cord, and then everything that branches off of that is part of the peripheral nervous system. And again, there's a lot more that we could learn about with the nervous system, but this is still kind of a survey course, so we're still just scratching the surface and not scratching it very deep. And lastly, you need to know that there's made of cells called neurons, which are nerve cells that carry electrical impulses. And this is a diagram of a nerve. You need to be able to draw and label. This one's a little funky in that the cell body is here, but essentially you need to know that there are dendrites, there's a cell body and an axon, and then there are terminals on the other end. And then these cells around this are called Schwann cells, or it's the myelinated sheath. And there's another video on YouTube that was uploaded a little earlier, just before this one, that explains how this electrical signal gets sent. But it moves from within one nerve from the dendrite to the axon. But once it hits this axon and gets sent to another neuron, it will start at the dendrite of the next neuron, move down the axon to the terminal, and continue on that sequence. So again, you have to be able to draw and label a diagram of an axon. So here's one. I'm going to skip this pretty quickly because I'm going to move through this really quick because there's another video that shows you how to draw this and how to label it. But you need to be able to state and talk about how a nerve sends a message from a receptor cell through your central nervous system back to your muscle. So here we've got our receptor, and we call these sensory neurons, or think of the neurons that we use to observe our environment, use our senses. So the easiest one to think about is touch. So think about your fingertips. So if we have sensors, nerve sensors in our fingertips, we're able to tell if we touch something hot or cold. There's an electrical signal that gets sent from those receptor neurons, or the sensory neurons, to our relay neurons through that electrical impulse, which that is explained in the other video. The relay neurons, in this case, are this represents a section of the spinal cord. Remember, spinal cord is part of our central nervous system. The central nervous system here, the spinal cord, processes that information, figures out what it needs to do with it, and then sends a signal down a motor nerve to an effector or a muscle to cause you to move. So if you touch something really hot or really cold, hopefully your reaction is to withdraw it, especially if it's hot, because that can cause nerve damage or cell damage to other kinds of tissue in your body, and your body will retract your hand. And that's all being sent through this pathway, from a receptor through sensory neurons to the relay neuron, through a motor neuron to the effector. And if you think about just how quick that happens, it's quite incredible that this signal gets processed and relayed and transmitted back to a muscle so quickly. And as you can imagine, if that didn't get sent quickly, organisms would not are not likely to survive in a changing environment. So, and I just want to point out that not all signals go straight to the brain. So some of these signals go to the spinal cord, which is really good because it can happen a lot faster. So our central nervous system is able to process that, and that's really nice and convenient that our spinal cord goes down at least through our core of our body, so that not all signals have to be sent all the way up to our brain and back, which would obviously extend the time, even in milliseconds, that signal needs to be sent. All right, so defining resting potential and action potential, and these words depolarizing and repolarizing. So an action potential is depolarization, and repolarization is what happens after the action potential to give back to resting potential. So let's look at this diagram right here. So I would pause this video and watch the other YouTube video at this point that explains this process but does not have this graph, and then come back to this graph. So pause this and return back. We're at 8 minutes and 20 seconds, so you can come back to this point. Okay, so let me continue on. Hopefully you paused and watched the other YouTube video. But I want you to notice on the y-axis here we've got membrane potential in millivolts, and on the x-axis we've got time in milliseconds. And this is showing you the speed of an action potential and the change in millivolts, or electricity, along a neuron. So this is measuring the inside of a neuron, of an axon. And if you notice at the beginning of this, we're starting at -70. So this is a relative charge. So the inside of the axon is -70 millivolts, or relatively negative compared to the outside. And once an electrical signal hits, so right around here, if you remember that the sodium channels open up and sodium floods into the axon, which depolarizes, which makes the inside less negative compared to the outside, and in fact overshoots this 0 to a +30. So the inside is actually more positive than the outside for a millisecond. And immediately after this action potential hits, and it causes the next section of the axon to open up its sodium channels, the sodium channels close for that section, the potassium channel opens up and allows potassium to flood in to into the cell. Yeah, allows sodium to, I apologize, allows sodium to flow out of the cell, to repolarize, so that some of the positive ions leave the cell, causing there to be an electrical gradient, so negative on the inside, positive on the outside, and it overshoots, restabilizes, and we've got our sodium-potassium pump going on here at 4 milliseconds that are removing the positive ions of sodium and potassium back to their original location. So more sodium on the outside, more potassium on the inside, so reversing where those ions are, and that come back to resting potential. And it isn't until it comes back to resting potential that the next signal can be sent. So there's almost a 4 millisecond gap between new signals. And so a signal is sent, and then it has to reposition. So I kind of think of an analogy of like a toilet flushing. You flush the toilet and you can't reflush that toilet until the tank fills back up. So the signal is sent and it has to wait until the tank is refilled before another signal can be sent. And what you notice is that the action potential always comes up to plus 30. It's never going to exceed that or come below that, and it needs to get to that point for an action potential to occur. So what's really interesting is it's called the all or nothing principle, and there's a threshold that this depolarization has to hit in order for the signal to be sent. So either it's sent or it's not. It's all or nothing. And you think about, well, sometimes you feel pain a little stronger than other times. Well, it's not because of this. It's not a stronger nerve signal that's being sent. It's actually the number of signals that are being sent. So if you have more nerves sending the signal, there's a stronger sensation or a stronger response. And if you have less signals being sent, then there's a less of a response. But it's an all or nothing kind of thing. And so again here we've got the same kind of thing. We've got sodium flooding in. We've got potassium flowing out. This is another diagram. I'm not sure if this is quite as helpful as the video and the animation that was in the other video. Okay, but here's another thing: how a nerve impulse passes along a non-myelinated neuron. I'll put this PowerPoint up on Blackboard, so you can click on this link, and it'll take you to a video. But this is also explained in the other video, as well as this. But just as a quick review, this is an axon terminal. This is the dendrite of the next neuron. We've got mitochondria that make ATP, which allow these vesicles that contain neurotransmitters to go through exocytosis, emit the neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, and then the postsynaptic membrane has proteins on it, or receptors, that accept specific neurotransmitters and then engulf them through endocytosis, thereby sending the next electrical signal. So it goes from an electrical signal to a chemical signal back to an electrical signal, all the way down from, let's say, a sensory neuron through the relay neurons back to the motor neurons. Okay, so that's nervous system, and we're done with that for now. We're going to come back to that with option E later in the year. But let's move on to the hormones, the other way that signals are sent. Now nerves, let me just point out, are quick. We can send signals very, very quickly through the nervous system. Hormones instead are transported in the blood, which means that it takes a little bit longer for these hormones to get where they need to go, but there's a longer term effect. But they work cooperatively to ensure this homeostasis. So here are some of the glands that that produce a lot of the hormones in our body. So we've got the pineal gland, the pituitary gland, the thyroid, which we'll talk more about later in the year. There's the thymus, the pancreas, the adrenal glands. These are kidneys, these white things here, but they're adrenal glands right on top that send, you guessed it, adrenaline. And in females, ovaries create some hormones that we've talked about already, progesterone and estrogen. At least eighth period has seen that. Seventh period, there's going to be another video that I want you to watch on reproductive system. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those hormones. And then in males, there's testosterone that comes out of the testes that you need to know 3 ways that this testosterone affects males. But that's in the reproductive system notes. Okay, so I hope you're seeing some connections. But we need to talk about some examples. So you need to state that homeostasis involves maintaining internal environment. So blood pH, carbon dioxide concentration, blood glucose concentration, body temperature, and water balance. So namely, what I'm going to talk about is an example of body temperature as well as blood glucose concentration. But just as a quick note, blood pH and carbon dioxide concentration are related. Increased carbon dioxide concentration in our blood triggers or changes the pH of our blood, and we have sensors in our bodies that monitor this pH. And when the pH changes, it actually causes us to have a reaction to exhale and then inhale. So we're trying to get rid of the carbon dioxide and then inhale. So if you ever tried to hold your breath for a very, very long time, there's a natural response after a considerable time, depending on your lung capacity. But when your oxygen runs out and your carbon dioxide level builds up, your body has a natural reaction to breathe. And this is often what causes drowning. If you try to hold your breath underwater for extended periods of time, your body's going to try to get rid of the carbon dioxide that's building up as a byproduct of cellular respiration. But if you're underwater, you're only going to be breathing in water, and it's going to flood your lungs and not have you'll have problems. But let's talk about body temperature and blood glucose. So here's the example of body temperature, and I would take a moment to copy this down, or what would be even better, instead of copying it down, is rewriting it in a different format that makes sense to you. But I'm going to start right here in the middle. I'm going to talk about it. So our normal body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which you know. In Celsius, it's 37 degrees. So let's go to the top first. So let's follow these arrows. So let's say your body temperature rises above normal. Well, what happens is that your nervous system sends signals to your skin blood cells, dermal means skin, your skin blood vessels, to dilate, which means to get wider, and sweat glands to secrete sweat. So what happens is that your blood vessels get bigger and they carry more blood. And remember that blood carries heat with it. So if the skin blood vessels dilate, they're carrying more blood, carrying more heat with them, and then hopefully your body's trying to release that heat to the environment. And so you often see when your body temperature rises, you might see that you start to blush, your face turns red. It's because you have increased blood flow to your skin, where hopefully your body is trying to lose that heat to the environment to cool your body down. Sweat also causes a little bit of transpiration. So some of the heat from your skin is used to evaporate that sweat and lose it from your body system. So body heat is lost to its surroundings and the body temperature drops towards normal. So the goal is this negative feedback loop to bring it back down to a low temperature. But if the body temperature drops below normal, your nervous system does something else. It signals the blood vessels to constrict, which means that there's less blood flowing through it, and your sweat glands remain inactive, which means that your blood is pulled away from your skin. And think about it, on a really cold day, you lose feeling in your fingers and your toes. Your body's actually doing a little more extremely just from your skin. It's actually keeping all that blood in your core and away from your extremities. But essentially, it's pulling blood away from your skin so that it's not losing it to the environment. And hopefully what that means is body heat is conserved, body temperature returns to normal. But if the body temperature continues to drop, your nervous system signals your muscles, remember, through the sensory neurons, through the relay neurons, which may be in your brain, and then sends them to your effectors or your muscles to contract involuntarily. which is shivering. Your body shivers. What it's doing is muscles are contracting very quickly, burning ATP, that energy molecule that we get from cellular respiration. That ATP, as a byproduct, gives off heat. That muscle activity generates body heat by burning ATP. That heat is generated from that, carried through the blood, and is hopefully rising your body temperature. Now, humans do one other thing. We put on clothes to prevent heat being lost in the cold to the environment. And that's something else that we do. But I hope that makes sense to you. But you need to be able to, I would say, it says state here, but for body temperature, this is something that you know pretty well. You understand pretty well, I hope. So it's something that I would say that you should probably be able to outline. And remember, homeostasis is maintaining stable environment, internal environment. And so this is an example of how our nervous system affects our normal body temperature. So a negative feedback, I mentioned this earlier, a negative feedback loop is essentially a system that allows for not a runaway effect. So it doesn't allow for, the one variable increasing doesn't cause another variable to increase, and then that second variable causes the first variable to increase. So it doesn't keep increasing exponentially or forever and infinitely. So instead, an analogy here would be if you're driving really fast and you realize you're going fast, you pump your brakes. And then when you go really, really slow, here a truck comes up behind you and honks at you, and you speed up. And so you speed up, slow down, speed up, slow down. And there's something in check that keeps things in check. And so oftentimes what we see in biology is that we have some kind of factor that causes a reaction in a sensory neuron that goes to the relay or integrating center of the brain, back to an effector that then is sensed again by sensory neurons. So this keeps it in check. So if the effector, say your muscles contracting, increases the heat, and your sensory neurons sense that, okay, yeah, there is more heat now at the skin, then it's going to shut down, it's going to send a signal to the integrating center to shut down the shivering of the muscles at the effector. And so it keeps it in check, instead of a positive feedback loop, which would be a sensor sending a signal to the integrating center to contract muscles to generate heat, and then this sensor saying, oh, it's hot, let's keep going, sends another signal to the integrating center that says to the effector, keep going, keep contracting the muscle, and it keeps that cycle up going forever and forever, so the body gets really, really hot. Well, that's not what happens. Most of the mechanisms, most of the feedback loops in humans are negative. There are a couple of positive feedback loops, but most of them are negative. All right, so we got to talk about one other thing. So we started this, the control of body temperature, including the transfer of heat and blood, the role of the hypothalamus, sweat glands, skin arterioles, and shivering. So again, this all happens in the brain. Things are being sent from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, and a nerve signal is being sent to the skin arterioles, or the blood vessels, the dermal blood vessels, to either constrict them, to make them really narrow when it's really cold, or to dilate them so that there's increased blood flow, so heat is lost through the skin. Okay? Sweat glands also help with that, and shivering we already mentioned. So this is another thing that you need to know is blood glucose, and you might know about diabetes, and this is very much related to it. So let me just point out a couple of connections. So this is the digestive system. We've got the stomach, and here's the duodenum, and here's the start of the small intestine. I want you to notice, this is related to a quiz question, here's the bile duct from the liver. So the gallbladder and bile are over here in this diagram to the left of the stomach. This tube connects with the tube or the duct that comes from the pancreas before it hits the small intestine. And that's the interconnection you need to be able to draw. That the bile duct and the pancreatic duct connect to each other. They intersect before they dump those enzymes into the small intestine. But you should also know that the pancreas creates something else for our blood sugar levels. So the pancreas also emits two different kinds of hormones into our blood, and those two are insulin and glucagon. And we'll talk a little bit about the kinds of cells here. So here's another feedback loop. When there's low blood glucose, the pancreas senses this as blood flows by it, and there are things called alpha cells in the pancreas that release this chemical called glucagon. Well, glucagon breaks down a polysaccharide that we use in our body called glycogen. Glycogen is stored in our liver, and glucagon breaks down that glycogen into glucose. Remember, glycogen is a polysaccharide, glucose is the monosaccharide. So essentially it's digesting the glycogen, releasing glucose into the blood, achieving a normal blood glucose level. If there's high blood glucose level, for example, immediately after eating a meal, especially that's highly glycemic, has lots of sugars, or think about like Halloween when you eat all that candy. So your blood has a lot of glucose in it. The pancreas, normally, this is in a non-diabetic person, the pancreas reacts by releasing insulin by its beta cells. So glucagon and alpha, insulin by beta. What insulin does is encourages their fat cells that take in the glucose from the blood, often stored in the liver, and as glycogen, so by taking out the high amounts of glucose in the blood achieves normal blood glucose levels. Now these two details are very, very important for you to know, that glucagon is released by alpha cells when there's low blood sugar to break down glycogen into glucose to put into the bloodstream. Insulin, on the other hand, is released by beta cells when there's too much blood sugar, and it reduces the glucose or blood sugar level. Okay, so you got to tell the difference between type 1 and type 2. Type 1, the beta cells don't produce enough insulin. So remember all that means is that when there's high blood sugar level, the body doesn't know what to do with it, or doesn't react appropriately to remove the blood sugar, which can cause major problems, especially to red blood cells. If you remember, you can ask me how that happens when we talk about osmosis in a little more detail. So people with type 1 diabetes can take insulin shots as they monitor their blood sugar level. So when they monitor their blood sugar level and see that they have a high blood sugar level, they can take insulin shots, and that extra insulin will help remove the glucose from their blood. Type 2 diabetes, cell receptors don't respond properly to insulin. So the body's making lots and lots of insulin, but the cells are not responding to that insulin, and therefore not removing the glucose from the blood. And type 2 is a lot more dangerous because obviously taking insulin is not going to help in this case. And so type 2 requires a lot more monitoring and being a lot more mindful of what kinds of foods one is eating, and eating low glycemic foods. And we'll talk about what high versus low glycemic foods mean when we talk about option A, which is human health and nutrition. I'm not sure what's going on with this graphic. Something messed up, so I'm not going to spend any time on it. But you should know this. So these are causes of type 2 diabetes, possible causes. So too much food with too much animal fat can lead to type 2 diabetes. Additionally, there may be a genetic component that causes insulin resistance, so that causes your cells to not respond to insulin. Not getting enough exercise, You can get genes that make you hungry, so you increase your intake of food, of sugar and fatty calories. And then if you're overweight, you need more insulin. So what ends up happening, and this ties back to our digestive system when we were talking about fiber, if someone has a lot of these fats and sugars in their body and their body's absorbing it, then they're going to have higher glucose levels or higher lipid values in their blood. But what's really important is that if you're not getting enough exercise, that fiber, and especially if you're getting older, that fiber content, increased fiber content, is going to help clear out some of the undigested and unabsorbed sugars and fats and polysaccharides that would normally leave your system, but it stays in your system without that fiber, can get absorbed into your body and increase your the nutrients in your blood, which can be problematic. So having exercise and fiber to remove that material is actually very, very good. And what a lot of researchers think is that the diet that people are taking in, and or the high glycemic diet, as well as lack of exercise, is leading to higher and higher rates of type 2 diabetes in the United States. But additionally, some genes could cause these beta cells in the pancreas to wear out more quickly. But your body needs more insulin but can't produce it, and the cells aren't responding to it, and that can cause type 2 diabetes. Okay, and that's it. So I know that's a long podcast, but my goal is that you have an opportunity to watch this in class, jot down questions, and we'll talk about it. Okay.